In the current day, we associate coal as a thing of the past, something that's been compressed over millions of years, and certainly not what you'd consider as a clean energy source for the years ahead. Turn the clock back only 100 years though, and this stuff was everywhere.
From power plants to household fires, coal was a tried and tested method of generating heat and power. Nowhere is this more apparent than on the railways. Steam locomotives can be fueled by many different heat sources. Some burn oil, others used wood, but they are most commonly associated with coal.
The logistics of replenishing millions of trains worldwide with enough steam power was a monumental task, and even the final stage of getting it into the firebox was a complicated process. Today we're going to look at the many ways that you could recoal a steam locomotive, and discuss why that is becoming increasingly difficult in the present day.
We've previously discussed the evolution of steam power itself, and coal was nothing new when the dawn of rail transportation came about. Many of the earliest steam locomotives actually burnt coke instead, which is produced from heating coal in an oxygen-free space. This removes impurities and leaves a high carbon fuel, producing hotter temperatures than coal, but of course being more costly to produce. Coke gives off far less smoke, and this was preferred by those who were hesitant about the newfangled railways.
As locomotives evolved, they gradually became better equipped to burn coal rather than coke, with improved designs to the firebox and how the drafting worked. As this was easier to obtain, this became the norm. These pioneering machines were small enough to have their coal loaded by hand, but as the world caught on to railway mania, a larger scale operation was quickly needed.
The Stockton and Darlington Railway of 1825, considered as the first public steam-powered railway, built this wall of coal drops in 1846. Wagons of coal could be taken up the slope to the top, and then the coal would be shovelled down to the engines waiting below. Making use of gravity became the basis for most coaling methods going forwards, but each railway had their own approach. Take this Grade 2 listed structure at Didcot Railway Centre, but don't actually take it, it is a building and it's listed and it's stuck in one place. This is actually a coal and water tower, and a stores room, all of your locomotive needs in one, like a motorway service station. It was built in 1931 for the Great Western Railway, essentially being a newer version of the coal drops at Shildon. A huge tank on top pipes water down to the cranes by the shed, whilst engines again wait at the bottom for coal. Trucks are propelled up the slope and into the building itself, with strict instructions that engines are not allowed to follow them in. Trucks like their privacy. The coal is unloaded into metal tubs, which have their own little plateway extending out from the balcony. With counterweights to make them easier to lift, the coal is dropped into the tender or bunker of the engine. That is, if they've stopped in exactly the right place. Whilst saving time, this process still required several people to shovel the coal, and it took time to restock the larger tender engines. If you're a fan of the Railway series, you might spot that it is this type of ramped coaling stage that is used at Tidmouth.
Smaller yards had less money for such facilities, so often a steam crane was used instead. If there wasn't room for a permanent yard crane, then sometimes a mobile steam crane would be used to lift the buckets instead.
A good example of this is in New South Wales, where an adapted version of the Stroudley Terrier was built with a crane attachment for such jobs. It still required several people to operate, and could only lift small buckets, but was a far nicer way of getting tons of coal up to the bunkers than manually shoveling it by hand. A locomotive fitted with a crane arm meant that it could move about to where it was needed, whilst also performing other duties in between, such as shunting. Though it wasn't as expensive as it is by today's standards, coal waste was not taken lightly by railway companies. Footplate crews on the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway were paid a premium for running below the estimated amount of coal for a trip, and this challenged them to think economically. One driver found a trick by picking up the coal that had spilled out into the yards after a crane had finished loading, making it seem like they had used far less coal than they actually had. How ecological.
Many railways, including most across the United States, began to use hopper wagons, which had doors on the bottom. The word derives from the machinery that's used to grind flour. They would be pushed onto a purpose-built chute, and then the coal would fall directly from the hopper straight down to the loco.
This was much quicker as it handled the coal in larger quantities. The drawbacks were it could be dangerous for those opening the doors, and would deteriorate the wagons and track faster as dirt would scatter by the wheels. The doors on hopper wagons especially had to be maintained so that the forces of gravity didn't push them open when the train was on the move. Normal plank wagons would have doors on the sides and sometimes on one end. This made them much easier to load straight onto ships' holds.
Perhaps the most specialised structure for this job during the steam age was the mechanised coaling tower.
This example at Carnforth is also Grade 2 listed, and is the last of what were once dozens of these brutal looking giants towering above locomotive depots. This one was built in 1938 for the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, and could store tons and tons of coal at once, all kept dry and ready to be loaded onto the locomotives waiting directly beneath. Some would again lift buckets of coal, but others would actually carry entire wagons right to the top to be tipped over.
Now, raising a coal truck 100 feet into the air sounds great, and it certainly has its advantages, but there are some surprising disadvantages to this as well. A key plus point is that these towers were space efficient, negating the need for long, gentle slopes to get rows of wagons up to the top. Individual wagons did have to be loaded onto the platform and uncoupled manually, but once they were at the top, their entire contents could be tipped over in one go, all at the pull of a lever.
The way these worked is an electrically powered platform was raised into the hood at the top. A metal bar on a spring would then run horizontally across the top of the wagon, securing it in place. The entire platform would then curve nearly 180 degrees over, until the wagon was nearly upside down and all the coal poured out, before being lowered back down. What was equally clever is that the coal could be sorted accordingly into separate storage areas. High-grade coal would typically be preferred for the big express engines, for instance, whilst poorer quality loads would be best used by small shunting locos. The operator could control which section the coal from each wagon would be directed to, and the loco would simply stand under the correct chute. Railway engines would have the luxury of choosing between a menu of different coals, like a motorway service station. To prevent build-up of dust, water taps were opened to spray the coal before it reached the tender, which would quickly dry off before it was thrown into the fire.
Despite all of these cost and labour-saving solutions, there were still some complications. Firstly, loaded coal trucks are heavy. They require vast amounts of electricity to elevate, so often it was preferred to use smaller skips to load the chutes more frequently. Whereas a traditional coaling stage requires more manual handling, there is nothing really that can go wrong. Whereas with a mechanised coaling tower, it requires power and a lot more moving parts, and generally there's a lot more faults that can occur. And if the power goes, there's not really a way of manually loading one of these things. Faults did occur as well, mainly due to how these chutes were loaded.
Turning wagons upside down was not only damaging to the timber panels, but also resulted in the oil from the axle boxes dripping out. When dozens of wagons a day were inverted, pints of grease and oil would be lost, and would build up within the walls of the chute. Dropping wagon loads of coal at once meant that there wasn't a chance to inspect them before they were unloaded.
Coal slack, branches, broken bits of wagon timber, and all manner of other things could find themselves mixed in with the coal, and then the entire contents would be poured down into the chute. There were occasions when the wrong wagons would find themselves on the chute as well, and their incorrect contents would fall into the mix.
One such occasion in Doncaster saw a truck of oil drums barrelling out. This was worsened when the next heap of coal was poured on top, the barrels splitting and gushing out gallons of oil. Not only was the oil wasted, but the chute rendered unusable and the coal far more difficult to work with. There were no such occasions when a locomotive would accidentally be hoisted up the coal tower though. They would simply be too heavy. And shame on the crew if they didn't notice what was happening. I can just tell that Thomas fans are getting story ideas, or being reminded of the one scene in season 6.
What are you doing?
The end of steam on the railways saw with it the demolition of many of these coaling towers. Smaller versions were built for loco ash as well, to be loaded into wagons to be taken away, but the age of diesel simply didn't need these facilities. As hideous as these brutalist ferroconcrete blocks were, they were an instantly recognisable symbol of a railway yard, and a good reference point for any train spotters for a place to head towards.
Coal, coke and other minerals were still required for industries though, and similar infrastructure to load and unload trains continues to this day. Some plants have rotating tracks, which can turn over a wagon on the spot. It's like a wooden railway train set come to life. Coal is still used on heritage railways of course, and often a front loader is used to load the locos. The tower at Carnforth is no longer in use, but a smaller example is at the North Yorkshire Moors Railway. Places such as the Swanage and the South Devon railways use conveyor belts to scoop up the coal instead. However, across the UK and many other countries, there is a crisis ongoing that means that the sight of coal itself is becoming increasingly rare.
To greatly simplify things, particularly in the UK, steam railways are struggling to find coal. For the past 5 years, the government has committed to phase out the use of household solid fuels and coal used in electricity generation. The last power plant to use this closed down in September 2024 as part of the pledge to turn to cleaner, more renewable energy sources.
Coke and anthracite is still needed in the production of steel and other specific industries. To that end, mines such as Aberpergum in Wales are still extracting high-grade anthracite, but steam coal is another matter. Fosse Fran mine closed in November 2023, the last remaining open-cast mine of coal suitable for steam railways.
This left the heritage industry in a tricky situation. Suddenly, there wasn't anywhere in the UK to find coal. With all preserved railways, road-based vehicles, and even static ones, there isn't quite enough demand to keep a large-scale mine in operation, even though there are still hundreds of years left of coal still just sitting in the ground waiting.
The alternative options are to import coal from other countries that are still mining it, such as Russia, Poland, and Australia. Not only is this wasteful transportation, but doesn't prove cost-effective, as only a certain amount of the coal arriving in the UK is usable for steam. The other choice is to come up with a substitute for coal. Several small firms have heard the cries from the places still requiring it, and have experimented with the creation of several types of fabricated coal. Some concoctions use olive oil husk, or material from rapeseed oil production. Others use small scraps of coal compressed into briquettes. Each approach has its own distinct results, and there isn't a standard that will work for most machines.
This begs the question, what actually is the problem? Steam engines have naked flame fires. Surely you could throw anything into the firebox and it would burn to create steam. Well, true, steam engines can burn a range of different fuels, but most were designed to run on coal, and they perform very differently when they're not. Even the type of coal used will have drastically different performance effects. Take the Great Western Railway for example.
Their lines ran to the coal mines of South Wales, so naturally they designed their locos to run on what they had access to. Engineers found what worked best was large grates for the Welsh coal to sit on, encased within a Belpaire firebox. On the other hand, railways across America had access to more low-grade coal, made of smaller lumps, so they adapted their locos to make the best of it. Coals from different parts of the world have different qualities. Some emit more smoke, some create more clinker, or simply don't produce as much heat. Coke and anthracite, meanwhile, burn with such a ferocious temperature that it would melt the firebars of many locos. There is hope yet in artificially formed coal, but ongoing trials show that they still perform differently depending on the engine and conditions.
So, steam engines are fussy, essentially. The issue is more than that though. It is a case of contradictions. Shutting the last mine and turning to cleaner energy production is great, but it's been done with little thought for the heritage organisations that still need it. Instead, they are having to import coal from all around the world, and that is by far more polluting than getting the coal that's just down the road. Producing alternatives such as biomass and e-coal is still very expensive, and it's still such a new technique that it's a long way off from being able to be mass-produced on the scale that is actually needed.
All the while, heritage groups are faced with paying over 4 times more for a ton of coal compared to what they would have had to pay less than a decade ago. Consequently, many railways have had to run less often in order to maintain funds, and ticket prices have generally soared to make sure that there's enough fuel to run the trains at all. In terms of emissions, though they blast out smoke and steam in a dramatic way, the actual pollution that the heritage sector outputs per year is only a fraction of what is emitted elsewhere. A statistic that keeps in my mind is that the amount of CO2 produced by running trains on the Talyllyn Railway for a whole year is equivalent to one flight distance from London to California.
This is an abbreviated overview of the current situation, and I recommend keeping up to date with the Heritage Rail Association as the situation is constantly changing.
Throughout 2024, many railways have got by because they've bought up as much of the remaining true coal from the now shut Fosse Fran mine, but that was only a short-term solution. If you want to understand the issue in more detail, Chris Eden Green has done several great videos on the coal crisis, some from even years ago when the problem was only just getting started, and I'll link those in the description.
What I also recommend is supporting a heritage organisation that is struggling. Gothic Locomotive has a great list on Instagram about ongoing appeals throughout the UK, and either by supporting them online or going to visit these places in person would make a huge difference. You could go and see steam trains doing their thing as they were built to do. I think that's worth it.
I'd love to know what you think of the current coal crisis, and what you think the best move in the future could be. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. It's a conversation that is crucial to heritage industries, who are now facing fewer and fewer options.
So, now we've discussed how steam locomotives use different types of coal, how best to get it on board, and why there isn't much coal for them to use in the present day. If you've enjoyed this really exciting talk about coal, then perhaps you'll enjoy the rest of the Guide Rail series, as on the first Friday of every month, we explore a different topic surrounding the world's steam-powered history. If you've enjoyed it that much, then you might want to support the channel on Patreon, as you get a bunch of extra stuff as a thank you by following the link in the description. Or if you've just mildly enjoyed it, or even not enjoyed it, then perhaps consider subscribing, and maybe the next video will be better, who knows. Either way, thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.
Many thanks to my brilliant channel patrons: Alex Goodman, GBH Train, D0280 Falcon, Sean Tempest, Random Thomas Fan, Dark White 73, Andrew Dyack, Reese Lee Walter, Ryan RTS, Ewan Pentland, Steam Power 4472, Jude 72, Firewind 10, Suddery Rails, Lunaker's Photography, Mario Sonic 64, Elias, and Soda Fox Art.